This is a video where we are going to be looking at the classification of joints. Just like anything in the body, joints can be classified both structurally and functionally. So structurally, they are classified based on their anatomical characteristics. So pretty much how they look, what they're made of, that kind of thing. We're going to be looking at if there is a joint cavity and what type of connective tissue is involved. Functionally, they're characterized based on the type of movement they permit. So what degree of movement is permitted, how much, if any, movement is permitted as well. Here is going to be a clickable anatomy overview or animation right here. So you can just click on this link in your slides. The structural classification of joints is based on two criteria. First thing that we want to look at when we are classifying these joints structurally is the type of connective tissue that binds the bones together. And then secondly, we're looking at the presence or absence of a space between the articulating bones. And this is called a synovial cavity. So we're going to be looking at the presence or absence of a synovial cavity. So there are three types of structurally classified joints. The first one is fibrous. And fibrous joints are where there is no synovial cavity, and the bones are held together by dense irregular connective tissue that is really rich in collagen fibers. So a couple of different sub-classifications under fibrous structural classification. The first one is sutures, where we have dense fibrous connective tissue. Then we have syndesmoses. These are more dense than the suture, like more dense fibrous connective tissue. An example of these would be kyphosis, and we will look at these when we talk about the joints that hold teeth in place. And then the third one is interosseous membranes. Remember, we saw these when we looked at the radius and the ulna. So it's the connective tissue holding the radius and the ulna together along their entire length. Cartilaginous joints is going to be the second structural classification. These also have no synovial cavity. And these bones are held together by cartilage. The subclassifications are going to be synchondrosis. These are made of hyaline cartilage and don't permit any movement at all. So an example is the epiphyseal plate. And then the second subclassification is symphysis. Remember, that is fibrocartilage, and it does allow for some movement, but it is very minimal. The example is the pubic symphysis. Last structural classification is going to be synovial. So these are joints in which the bones forming the joint have a synovial cavity. And they're united by the dense irregular connective tissue of an articular capsule. And this is often surrounded by accessory ligaments. So here, this one is going to have a cavity, synovial cavity, and we are going to have dense irregular connective tissue as well. So these are going to be our more complex joints, like the hip, knee, shoulder, and elbow, and we will look at all of these individually as well. Now, functionally, we can classify joints differently. So functional classification of joints relates to the degree of movement that they permit. So in this classification, we are just looking at the degree of movement. So they're also classified as three types. Synarthroses. This is an immovable joint, so we're not going to allow any movement at this joint. We're looking at examples of suture and gomphosis, and we will look at the gomphosis yet as well. So sin, remember that the prefix sin actually means together. So these are joints in which the two articulating points are actually held together and they don't move independently. Amphiarthroses are going to be the next functional classification, and this is a slightly movable joint, so allows for a little movement. Thinking about the pubic symphysis and intervertebral discs are some really good examples of these. Amphi, prefix, means on both sides. So it allows for a little bit of movement. Diarthroses are going to be the last one, and these are freely movable joints. So we're looking at those complex, very highly movable joints like the hip, knee, shoulder, elbow. And actually the word itself, diarthroses, means movable joint. All diarthroses are going to be synovial joints. They have a variety of shapes and they permit several different types of movement. So firstly, we'll talk about fibrous joints. Just like I stated before, they lack a synovial cavity, and the articulating bones are held very closely together by dense, irregular connective tissue. So they permit very little, pretty well like no movement. And there are 3 types of fibrous joints. They are sutures, syndesmoses, and interosseous membranes. So a suture is a fibrous joint. It's composed of a thin layer of dense irregular connective tissue. And sutures only occur between the bones of the skull. The irregular and interlocking edges of sutures give them added strength. They also decrease their chance of fracturing. So you can kind of see it's quite irregular here. It's not just a straight line, but this actually adds strength to that joint. In older individuals, sutures are immovable. So when we're thinking about the functional classification, immovable joints are synarthroses. So these are going to be in adults and anyone older. So in older individuals, their sutures are going to be synarthroses. But in infants and in children, these sutures are slightly movable, so functionally classified as amphiarthroses. Sutures really play important roles in shock absorption in the skull. They allow for this little bit of joint that can actually move a little bit depending on the force that is applied. It allows the bones to move slightly when force is applied to decrease the chance of fracturing the bones. Some sutures, although present during the growth of the skull, they're actually replaced by bone in the adult. These sutures are called synostosis, or a bony joint. These are going to be bony joints. And this is a joint where there is complete fusion of 2 separate bones into one. So we're going to have like bones fusing at a joint. So for an example of this would be the frontal bone. It actually grows in two halves that join together across a sutural line. So usually they're completely fused by the age of 6, and the suture becomes inobscure. So you kind of have a suture, a synostosis, kind of around this area of the frontal bone as a baby and as a fetus that actually fuses together. So if the suture actually doesn't fuse and it persists beyond age 6, it's actually called a frontal suture. And a synostosis is classified as a synarthrosis because it is immovable. So we kind of want to think about all joints as what is their functional classification and then also what is their structural classification. A syndesmosis is a fibrous joint in where there is greater distance between the articulating surfaces and more dense irregular connective tissue is used than in a suture. So the dense irregular connective tissue is typically arranged in a bundle or a ligament, and this allows the joint to allow for limited movement. So you can get a little bit of movement at these joints. One example of a syndesmosis is the distal tibiofibular joint, where the anterior tibiofibular ligament, right here, actually connects the tibia and the fibula. And it does permit slight movement. So this ligament here is going to be in amphiarthrosis. Another example of a syndesmosis is called a gomphosis. And this is where a cone-shaped peg fits into a socket. So the only examples of gomphoses in the human body are the articulations between the roots of teeth and their sockets. And you're going to find these both in the maxillae and in the mandible. So these are going to be the upper jawbone and the lower jawbone. So here you can see that the tooth fits into the socket of the alveolar process. This is going to be a gomphosis and the only example of a gomphosis. A healthy gomphosis actually allows no movement. So it's going to be functionally classified as a synarthrosis. The final category of fibrous joints is the interosseous membrane, and this is, remember, that substantial sheet of dense, irregular connective tissue that binds neighboring long bones, and it does permit slight movement, so it's also going to be in amphiarthrosis. There are two principal interosseous membrane joints in the body. Remember this one that occurs between the tibia and the fibula, and then the other one that is between the radius and the ulna in the forearm. So those are going to be the two main places where we're going to see these interosseous membranes. Cartilaginous joints, like fibrous joints, they lack a synovial cavity, and it allows for little to no movement. Here, the articulating bones are tightly connected by either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. And there are two types of cartilaginous joints, synchondroses and symphyses. A synchondrosis is a cartilaginous joint in which the connecting material is hyaline cartilage. An example of this type of joint is the epiphyseal plates that connect the epiphysis and the diaphysis of a growing bone. Functionally, a synchondrosis is an immovable joint, so we would classify that functionally as a synarthrosis. And when the bone elongation stops, bone replaces the hyaline cartilage and the synchondrosis becomes a synostosis. Remember, that is a bony joint. So then it becomes a synostosis. Another example of a synchondrosis is the joint between the first rib and the manubrium of the sternum, which is also ossified during the adult life and becomes an immovable synostosis, or a bony joint. Next, a symphysis. This is a cartilaginous joint also, in which the ends of the articulating bones are covered with hyaline cartilage, but a broad, flat disc of fibrocartilage connects the bones. An important little note is that all symphyses occur in the midline of the body. So all symphyses occur in the midline of the body. The pubic symphysis between the anterior surfaces of the hip bone, you can see here. This is one example of a symphysis. This type of joint is also found at the junction of the manubrium and the body of the sternum, and at the intervertebral joints between the bodies of the vertebrae. All symphyses are slightly movable joints, so they are all classified as amphiarthroses functionally. Next, we will be looking at synovial joints. So synovial joints have certain characteristics that distinguish it from other joints. The unique characteristic of a synovial joint is the presence of a space called a synovial cavity or a joint cavity, and this is between the articulating bones. Because the synovial cavity allows considerable movement at a joint, all synovial joints are classified functionally as freely movable or diarthroses. The bones at synovial joints are covered by a layer of hyaline cartilage, which is called articular cartilage. And the cartilage covers the articulating surfaces with a smooth, slippery surface, but it doesn't bind them together. The articular cartilage reduces friction between the bones at a joint, and this is during movement, and it helps a lot to absorb shock. So a sleeve-like articular capsule here surrounds the synovial joint, and this encloses the synovial cavity right here. And this articular capsule also unites the articulating bones. The articular capsule is composed of two layers. We have an outer fibrous membrane. See that here, and you can see that better in this diagram. The outer fibrous membrane, and then we also have an inner synovial membrane. The fibrous membrane, it usually consists of dense, irregular connective tissue, mostly collagen fibers, that attaches to the periosteum of the articulating bones. So you can see the periosteum here in this diagram, and the fibrous membrane attaches to the periosteum of the articulating bones. The fibers of some of the fibrous membranes are arranged as parallel bundles of dense, regular connective tissue that are highly adapted for resisting strains. And now these are called ligaments. The inner layer of the articulating capsule, the synovial membrane, This is composed of areolar connective tissue with elastic fibers. So areolar connective tissue, this is elastic. Elastic fibers. At many synovial joints, the synovial membrane includes this accumulation of adipose tissue, and this is called articular fat pads. Can't really see them on here, but in many other synovial joints, the synovial membrane also includes articular fat pads. The synovial membrane secretes synovial fluid, and this is a viscous, clear or pale yellow fluid that's named actually in similarity to its appearance and consistency to an uncooked egg white. The fluid forms a thin film over the surfaces within the articular capsule. Now, the function of the synovial fluid is mainly to reduce friction within the joint, and this is by lubricating the joint and absorbing shock, and it also supplies absorb shock as well. It also supplies oxygen and nutrients to the chondrocytes within the articular cartilage, and it also removes carbon dioxide and metabolic waste from those chondrocytes. So we're going to say provide nutrients and O2, and we're also going to remove CO2 and waste. And this is from the chondrocytes of the articular cartilage. Many joints, or many synovial joints, also contain accessory ligaments. And these are called extracapsular and intracapsular. So extracapsular and intracapsular. So extracapsular ligaments, these naturally lie outside the articular capsule, and some examples are like the fibular and tibial collateral ligaments of the knee joint. And then intracapsular ligaments, these are within the articular synovial membrane. So examples of these would be like the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments, or the ACL and the PCL of the knee joint. The various movements of the body create friction between moving parts, and because of this, we have bursae and tendon sheaths. So bursae, these are sac-like structures that are strategically situated to alleviate friction in some joints. They do kind of resemble joint capsules because they have an outer fibrous membrane and then an inner synovial membrane. So they cushion the movements of one body part from another. Tendon sheaths, these also reduce friction at joints. These are tube-like bursae that actually wrap around tendons that experience considerable friction. And that will be the end of Chapter 9, Part 2.